Now, this video has been requested by the same gentleman that asked me to make a video about the Brazilian women divorce issue. And I'm quite pleased that he asked me this because this subject is far more interesting, to be frank. And he asked me to talk about the origins or the evolution of language. It's a topic that is not unfamiliar to me. I was not my specialty, but something I've always been interested in, and of course coincided with my general linguistic interest. So let's go to the beginnings, not yet of the origin or the evolution of language, but of the question, how long have people been trying to figure this out? Now, people have actually been trying to figure this out for quite some time. I mean, the story of the Tower of Babel, the splintering, the splitting of languages, the sundering of one great language into many so that no one could understand each other. It's a famous story. And behind the metaphor, behind the picture being painted, there's a lot of truth to that. Because what we know, we don't know a whole lot actually, but what we know, in a similar fashion to, say, mitochondrial Eve, the female ape that we all stem from ultimately, all languages stem from one mother language, a proto-mother language, the origins of which are lost to time and the mists of obscurity. We don't know. But they've been trying to figure this out for quite some time, and there were various attempts at trying to piece this together, this puzzle. It wasn't really until the late 18th century or the 19th century that people began to take this quest to understand the origins of language somewhat more seriously. And it began with the discipline of philology. Now, philology isn't really in a lot of use these days. The term most commonly encountered in modernity is comparative linguistics. Philology used to be what it was called, but it's basically comparative linguistics. And it started in the 18th century. And it began with the deciphering of various texts and trying to understand what the relationship of the words, particularly the sounds, the phonemes, the individual sounds in certain languages was to other languages, which then turned out to be related. And then they tried to work out all the kinks of how these sounds changed. For example, the Brothers Grimm, you may be familiar with them. They're famous for their fairy tales, the Grimm fairy tales, Little Red Riding Hood, Rotkäppchen in German. They were also equally famous for their work in comparative linguistics and philology. They came up with something called Grimm's Law, which is a sound law that affects certain Germanic consonants and differentiates itself from other sounds in Indo-European languages. I won't bore you with the details, but nevertheless, they did that. And then along came a man named August Schleicher. And August Schleicher was obviously a German, and he did a lot more work in this field. And throughout the 19th century, up until the beginning of the 20th century, this was pretty much the first attempt at seriously reconstructing the origins of language itself, as distinct from the human beings that produce language, which is a problem, and I'll get to that in a bit. Guys like Schleicher, another guy, a Danish guy named Werner, and a bunch of other guys, they attempted to reconstruct different languages, usually of the so-called Indo-European family. This is a large family, and I won't get lost in the details for you, but it includes the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, the Celtic, the Baltic languages, and a few others. Within Europe, there are only 3 languages that are not actually Indo-European, those being Hungarian, Estonian, and Basque. And all have interesting stories of their own, but no. So this was the discipline they engaged in, philology, comparative linguistics, which essentially was just reconstructing both the sounds, the phonemes, but also the morphemes, the structure of this proto-language, and it came to be called Proto-Indo-European. And after a while, they had a pretty good idea of what it must have sounded like, probably. In the 20th century, they discovered a language called Hittite, which was even older than the oldest written texts that were available, which were Sanskrit, and added even more information. Yeah, all this stuff was going on, focusing on language as distinct from the human being that produces language. And this continued on for quite some time, well into the 1980s. A lot of work was done by the late linguist, this man named Joseph Greenberg, who was active at Stanford University. And he tried to go just beyond the call of duty to reconstruct language families, not of just specific groups like Indo-European or Finno-Ugric, but language groups spanning continents. He tried to reconstruct the common ancestor of all Native American languages, and they're vastly different. There's so many different Native American languages in South America, Central America, North America, and he tried to create a common proto-language from that, or rather discover one, reconstruct it. Nostratic has been this long-term project, this idea that all Asian and European languages are somehow related, and so they try to go about that way. And people are doing the same for African languages, which are vastly different from each other, all just focusing on the languages. Along comes Darwin. Darwin really set the ball rolling in so many regards for so many different disciplines, but people came to think about language in a different way, not just this, here we have these texts. And let me, before I proceed, mention that the fundamental problem of the comparative linguistic approach, or the model, is that it's wholly reliant on ancient texts. And as long as those texts have not been delivered to us, there's going to be a dearth of information with which to work. And so it's limited. That's why you can only go so far back. And spoken language is always primary. Remember, written language is a separate issue, and it has only been around for about 6,000 years, give or take. And language has been around for a lot longer than writing has. But along comes Darwin, and so this is how we evolved, and this is what happened. And people start thinking about this issue in a different light. They say, no. We can't just look at text. We can't just reconstruct the sounds and the morphemes. And yeah, we're making progress that way, but that's not telling us anything about how human beings came to acquire language, or rather evolve language, to use Darwinian terms. And there really wasn't that much progress with regards to this up until fairly recently, because a lot of it was just guesswork. Now, the gentleman who asked me to do the video suggested, this is his personal preference or his inclination, that the first gesture theory, which is a prominent hypothesis amongst evolutionary linguists, the first gesture theory, stating that before there were sounds, before anything else existed, there were gestures. And I actually think there is a fair amount of evidence for that. You can look at something such as the Furchtgrinsen, which is actually a German term, but it's been imported in general sense to biology, that is ethology of animals. Furchtgrinsen, literally the fear or fright grin. And this is then typified by the animal baring its teeth in a gesture of fright or anger or aggression or what have you. And so you see this across the board, particularly in every animal, particularly in birds and especially in mammals. And so it's not a huge step to move from that to some kind of more complicated, articulated form of gesturing that you probably see even today amongst our fellow ape species, such as orangutans, chimpanzees, gorillas, and so on and so forth. So I would put stock into that theory. However, the problem with first gesture theory is it doesn't really tell you very much of the actual qualities of language. It tells you, well, this is probably how it evolved. Here's the evidence, and the data suggests this. And like I said, it's reasonably compelling. But before I proceed, let's remember that the fundamental problem in discerning the origins of language is that no written records. That's not only no written records, no archaeological records, no fossil records. All of these things are available to other disciplines. Philology, that is comparative linguistics, archaeology, and paleontology, respectively, and they all kind of feed into evolutionary biology, and so there's a synergy there. Everyone is just guesstimating and speculating. Everyone, doesn't matter what their expertise is, as to how language actually arose. First gesture theory, okay, that doesn't explain the nature of language itself. Now, grammar, and I'm using grammar in the sense of a system, of rules, reasonably complex rules, a closed system of syntactic rules that make up a language that allow it to function, that, for example, is not explained by first gesture theory. And there are really two competing views as to how, in the abstract sense, language evolved. You have the adaptionist view and you have the spandrelist view. Now, if those of you who watch my Contented Irrationalist video, I talked quite a bit about spandrels, an idea, theories propagated by Stephen Jay Gould. Yes, he was a communist. Let's not commit the genetic fallacy. There's a lot of evidence for spandrels, whatever his views and political views might have been. No genetic fallacies here. That's one idea, and I think I'm not really partial to either. But clearly, language itself is a product of bigger brains, to put it simply. And species with large brains similar to us also have complex means of communication. Whether that's classified as language or not is a separate issue, such as whales and dolphins, that is cetaceans. But clearly a bigger brain, and because they communicate in a fairly complex way. I mean, individual orcas have their own songs and what have you. Big brain is just key. The big brain is key to this. The complexities of a grammar, the closed system of rules that a language is ruled by, how did that come about? I think that's probably a spandrel, because this represents the far end of communication. If the most basic form of communication is this Furchtgrinsen, this sort of this grunting, this baring of the teeth, and then somewhere along there's an intermediary gesturing of hands, of feet, of maybe pounding the chest, and you keep on moving further and further along, this is the far end, human language. The adaptionist view is that language, even abstract language, evolved as a consequence of it just having adaptive value. But that's true too. I mean, adaptive value in a survival and reproductive sense, of course. But neither camp can account, the spandrelist, neither spandrelist nor the adaptionist camp can account for whence the abstract nature of language came. This is just, unfortunately, unanswerable. Now, I'm going to bring in a little bit of technical jargon from formal linguistics. I mean, those of you might know Noam Chomsky, the father of linguistics. No, I don't agree with most of his political views. Let's not commit the genetic fallacy again, but he has done a lot of important and interesting, and I think valid work in the field of linguistics. And he turned linguistics into a legitimate science by proposing the idea, which has since been vindicated many times over through theoretical models, that language operates on a parameters and principles system. That is to say, languages have rules. There are universal rules that all languages operate by, and somehow, at some point in time, there's a diversification, a splintering, but this is just a turn of parameters, as it were. These are different parameters. For example, different languages have different syntactic hierarchies. They're different word orders, to put it really simply. You have a SOV, subject, object, verb, like Korean, Japanese, Turkish, and SVO, such as subject, verb, object, English, Chinese, and then you have quite rare languages that are verb, subject, object, such as Welsh or Irish, and then you have even rarer languages which are object, subject, verb, and what have you. The most common models, I think, count for 90% or 80% of the languages of the world are the SOV, subject, object, verb. That is the most popular model, 60% of the languages, and SVO. These are just different systems. Different parameters, part of the same hierarchy of rules, ultimately. When the child learns these rules, it chooses the parameters, and those parameters get set. I'm mentioning this because whatever theory scientists come up with for the evolution of language, it's going to be hard-pressed to account for the complexities, the syntax, the morphology, and in particular, the semantic aspects of language. I personally think that we can account for the parameters and principles system that Chomsky has proposed, Because as I mentioned in my escape velocity video, I talked about recursion, and recursivity seems to be a universal principle in the sciences. And of course, it's a principle of language. I mentioned the classic sentence of, she told me that he didn't want to go to the movies on that day because they saw the rain, which caused them to look for their umbrellas, which they later couldn't find, and so on. That's recursion, right? This endless chain of clauses, embedded clauses. So it could be that language as an abstract, with respect at least to the rules, the syntax, the grammar, could have only taken one route, that is the route of recursion, because recursivity might be a universal principle and you just can't have language without it. I'm actually very partial to that idea. But we run into a real issue when it comes to the semantics of it all. The problem is that there's no theory you could propose that's going to really adequately describe the existence and emergence of semantic categories. And why do I say this? Because semantic categories, which I don't think follow any sort of recursive rule to my knowledge, as opposed to syntax independent from semantics, these things really exist unto their own, and semantic categories only exist in as much as conscious, intelligent observers, listeners, and speakers can make use of them. It's the famous issue that arises that I mentioned in Chimeras of Meaning. All right, a universe filled only with rocks and pointy triangle objects with no consciousness. It doesn't. I mean, nobody's going to be aware of that. That means, of course, that semantic categories are only valid in as much as human beings exist. I'm not saying they don't exist. It's just they exist. Their existence is dependent on us. And there's nothing like semantic categories in the animal kingdom that we know of. And we can talk about abstractions. We can talk about economics. We can talk about medicine. We can talk about philosophy. We can talk about wisdom. How do we account for this? I frankly don't know. And we are grasping at straws when we try to figure that out. My personal assessment of the origins of language, the evolutions, as I said, I think there is a lot to be said for the gesture first theory, but it doesn't account for a whole lot of things such as the development of abstract syntactic rules. It doesn't account for the semantic aspects. And whether it's an adaptionist, it could go either way. I think people are going to continue arguing about this. The problem is we just don't have the records. And I think it's going to be a lot of speculation for a long time to come. However, all is not lost. If we are to decipher one day the nature, the origins of language, it's actually going to be through genes. Now, back in the early 90s, there was a family, I think it's referred to as the PE family, that was studied because it had several members with what appeared to be a disease, a disability, that produced speech errors. That is to say, they had sort of dysmorphic speech patterns. And it was studied, and then in the late 90s, they actually uncovered the gene for this, which has been called FOXP2. It stands for, I believe, fork head box protein P2. That's off the top of my head, if I recall that right. So this fork head box protein P2, FOXP2 is the abbreviation, seemed to have some sort of relationship because these researchers discovered that the FOXP2 gene in this PE family was messed up. It was not working properly. There were mutations. Something was going on there. Well, what do good scientists do? They start studying the FOXP2 gene in other species. What do they discover? Very interesting. They discover in birds and mammals, the only birds and mammals pretty much, that distortions in the FOXP2 DNA sequence or mutations can lead to miscommunications in those species. So songbirds was a very prominent one. So that songbirds that have some sort of problem with their FOXP2 gene can't communicate or can't sing properly. Mice aren't able to communicate in the way that they do when their FOX2 gene has issues with it. Very interesting. Do we know a lot more than this? Not really. We know that it's related to language, this FOXP2 gene, but we don't know very much more than that. But all is not lost. Using the ethologist method, if more of these genes were discovered, for example, in people with other speech disorders, speech pathologies, what have you, that there is something wrong with some gene or a gene is discovered, this could be built upon. And much like researchers did with the FOXP2 gene in the late 90s, this could be studied, it could be isolated, and then applied to other species. I reckon if you had enough information, genetic information, with respect to genes relating to language acquisition, language preservation, language production, you could create a very good picture of a much more accurate picture than using archaeology, philology, anything else of how language might have evolved if we, that is scientists, or not we, but people, human beings, could pinpoint what those functions are. We might be able to trace back historically and prehistorically, maybe. Sadly, that's a long way off. I don't think that's going to be happening anytime soon. The FOXP2 gene, to my knowledge, is the only one we're aware of that really has a profound effect on language. I might be wrong about that because I'm not totally on current events here, but it seems to be the case. So we are kind of fumbling in the dark when it comes to the origins of language, and we have ideas. There are different views on within those ideas. Even if you accept the gesture-first theory, the adaptationist spandrel, none of this accounts for the complexity of language, the syntax, the semantic categories. It's interesting to ponder, but in some ways it's kind of a lost cause because, at least not anytime soon, we're not going to be able to isolate and figure out what's what with respects to language and how it evolved. I think we'll be able to understand what language is at the level of the brain. Oh, this is another thing. Once we understand the brain in its totality, which we're so far away from doing, this will be another major contributing factor in understanding the origins and beginnings of language. But I don't want to keep going on. I wanted to make this a relatively brief video. So I hope that at least answers some of your questions. It's a good question to ask, but one, unfortunately, with far fewer answers than perhaps you had wished there would be. But we have to be intellectually honest, don't we? Anyway, thanks for your donation, and take care, whatever your time zone might be. Bye-bye.